ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa has again defended his CR17 campaign funding, which saw him ascend to the party's presidency. He told the State Capture Inquiry that he doesn't know who funded him, saying this was to ensure there was no expectation of a trade-off. Ramaphosa adds that funds weren't used to buy votes, but instead to transport supporters as well as for airtime and food.
Now, the campaign managers had taken a conscious decision that they would not involve me at all in the fundraising process. They had also taken a conscious decision to say they would not want me to even know who would give money to the campaign, because they wanted almost to create a wall that those people who gave money should never really think that there is anything they will get in return, and that if I knew, there could be that compromise. So they took a conscious decision.
Ramaphosa also refutes claims that R1 billion was raised.
Money that was raised was some 300 million or so, but never R1 billion. But I don't know the full facts, because they've literally decided to keep it away from me. And the money, what was it used for? There's a legend that goes around that the money was used to buy votes, and far from it. And I said to my comrades right at the beginning, I never want to be part of a campaign that is going to descend into all these deviant type of behaviors that we talk about in the ANC about vote buying. And I even said I would rather lose the race rather than have votes bought. So what was the money used for?
Let's get some impressions then on the President's testimony at the Commission of Inquiry. I'm joined now by SACP First Deputy General Secretary, Mapaila. Soli, good evening and thank you very much for your time tonight. First and foremost, let's take it back a little bit to yesterday. I'm sure it was not a surprise for you, because I'm sure it's something that you would have raised with your alliance partners. But what did it feel like to hear the now President was previously the Deputy President, also head of the Deployment Committee, say that they got it wrong?
Well, firstly, we welcome the President's appearance at the State Capture Commission, because this is very important for the rule of law and accountability in our democracy. And he set a very good example. With regard to what he said, obviously, you can't always be correct, but I think that the policy needs to be tweaked upon so that it can be consistent with the mandate of the ruling party. At the moment, it's actually very much inconsistent, both with the mandate of the ruling party, which it got the support from the electorate, as well as sometimes it gets into conflict with the rules in government. So there's a thin line in which we need to improve on it, so that the cadres deployed in the states can then be able to understand its application properly.
But there was also a sense from that testimony that would point to the House divided and the divisions of that House resulting in, for example, your fellow comrade Jacob Zuma making decisions without consulting that deployment committee. I mean, as the alliance, why do you think that happened?
Well, it depends on the speed of things that needs to be done from time to time. There will be deployments that are not even processed through the deployment committee. But ideally, critical deployments should go through that structure, because it's a critical structure for the ruling party in order to align deployments in accordance with its own mandate and policies. Because sometimes you can't have the electorate holding the party accountable for a mandate that is deployed, that is implemented by people who doesn't even believe in its particular mandate. So to start with, I think South Africa has to accept that all parties across the world, including other parties in this country beyond the ANC, use deployment system when they are governing. There's no single party that can simply say that bring your members there, they can come and implement this and that. So having recognized that, we need to improve the system so that it doesn't interfere, particularly with civic duty, because civic duty is for all citizens, and the mandate of the party must be properly clarified so that even the citizens don't see the party as a hindrance, for instance, to their participation in state affairs.
Yeah. So speaking of civic duty, I mean, that's what the president raised, that, well, all parties in the world, in fact, it's been proven in a study, he says, by the, I think, OAE, he mentions, or something of that nature, that deployment does work if it's conducted properly. Now, in the case of South Africa, we have just found out that close to 3,300 senior officials in government do not have the necessary qualifications. What do you think should happen to them? The president says, well, we can't just now fire them, but they are there.
Yeah, well, it depends on the system. You remember in South Africa, we had to even introduce the concept of the SACP, South African Qualification Authority, to look into prior learning of several African people with different skills, but which were not recognized by certificates. But when it comes to duties, those people have been performing those duties for decades, for instance. So there's been a combination of factors in that regard. Sometimes when these studies are done, they don't take that into account, or they don't put that into context. They just make a broad statement. But I think generally the approach has been to try the best attempt possible to deploy the most suitable cadres with qualifications. In fact, this is always emphasized in the deployment committee.
Yeah, but we are not getting that sense of assurance and I suppose the answer as to why it happened and why it's not going to happen going forward. How is it going to be prevented from the president's testimony? I mean, he acknowledges that, yes, it did happen and there were mistakes that were made. Do we know exactly what those mistakes are, and how do we then prevent that going forward?
Yeah, some of the mistakes have been mentioned at the commission. For instance, there was a deployment at Dinel, a terrible deployment. It didn't come through the deployment committee process, but it was done. And as we know, the so-called Gupta influence played a major role in that deployment and the decline of that particular institution. People arrived there with mandates. This was presented at the commission. So those are some of the instances where the party's mandate has been appropriated by a faction or a grouping or even the leader, who just imposes himself or herself on the leadership collective, and then bring friends and whoever that they think will serve their interest and no longer the interest of the people which the party seeks to achieve.
Yeah. And how do we prevent that from happening again?
Of course, is to develop an overarching policy that should guide all of government, including ruling parties, beyond the ANC, across the board at municipal level, provincial as well as national levels, so that every other party must know the limits of its influence with regard to policy in terms of implementation and deployment of people who lead that particular policy. The instruments, the interrelationship between the state function and the government function, because sometimes we conflate this thing to be one. And largely, you find that the state function, that's where the political parties largely participate to get their votes and members serving their respective executives at various levels of government. But from there, they must have a government machinery, which should be a permanent machinery that is able to fulfill the mission of government. That's when, for instance, we talk about government officials that are able to serve all public without due regard to political affiliation, including in other instances, for instance, we call that the citizen in uniform, basically doesn't necessarily mean the uniformed citizen like the police or the soldiers or the nurses, but in some instances they have that kind of characterization of government officials. So that citizen in uniform serves all people equally. So that's the final policy that is required to push that line.
Did you get any clarity, from the testimony, especially today, around the CR17 funding and how that money was used? And was that a believable explanation for you?
Yeah, quite clearly. It's not coming out for the first time. You remember that this was surreptitiously released in the public through, I think, when these matters were subpoenaed through the public protector process. So everybody knows. But in the main, the explanation was quite sufficient for some of us, although we must raise the point that it should be worrying when political parties or individuals that contest political office can have ability to raise monies beyond even that of their organizations. So that's in an area that needs further regulation. But I think I'm happy that, or as the party, we are generally happy that the political party funding system will begin to intervene and regulate this particular environment. Because all parties, by the way, do the same. I think you can go and ask the DA and every other one. A few years ago in the local government in Johannesburg, just the city alone, how much they spent for that particular city and how they raised the money. But these ones, at least, they were accounted for. And we are happy that the president was not involved in the nitty-gritties of that. He had a committee that was looking into this and therefore distributing the funds wherever they were appropriate to be utilized to fulfill his mission of the campaign. Yeah. And of course, like it indicated, all other candidates did so. But the bottom line is not even to go to there, is to look into the fact that every single South African and member of the ANC should be able to be elected to any position without having money. It's quite clear that there are those that will never see the high office because the high office is too expensive.
Now, there are those who are finding it difficult to say the president didn't know completely what was going on. If, for example, there could be emails directing where funds would need to be deposited into which account, how does he know how much money is there, and so on and so forth? There is a sense that when he feels like it, he doesn't know the details of what's happening in that account, but he also knows what's happening in that account as far as giving direction. I mean, does it not make you uncomfortable?
Look, we take his word and we don't doubt him. The issue is that if he had directed people to a particular account, or he would have spoken to particular individuals, even himself, but as to how much they are able to contribute is something else. And I think he clarified that particular matter. So we are satisfied with the explanation, albeit to have raised the concern regarding individual funding for party political campaigns, which I think in the past was unknown in the ANC. But now, given the level of factions that have taken very strong positions and access to resources by members of the movement, then it's a free-for-all now. Everyone can go and raise funds to campaign at any level, and that has been the norm. And I think that this process will bring in new policies inside the movement so that members can also be nominated or elected to various positions based on their ability to understand the movement and commitment to serve the people.
First Deputy General Secretary of the SACP, Mapaila, appreciate your time and thanks very much for joining us tonight here on the Newsfeed Late Night.